Humanity is innumerable, spread across the stars, with a military might befitting a galaxy-spanning empire like the Imperium. And yet, for all their numbers, there are a few individuals within humanity, or those who are ascended beyond it, who have become renowned even beyond their peers. In this series of logs, we shall take a look at some of those Adeptus Astartes of particular legend in this modern era, known collectively as the champions of humanity. Today, we return to a world and system visited several times in this mini-series to look at perhaps the greatest of the Astartes-related individuals in the modern Imperium. Admittedly, he's not technically an Astartes, but rather the rank above them. One of the sons of the Emperor, a Primarch, a demigod of war, and the source of the genetic material for an entire legion of Space Marines. He built an empire in the Great Crusade, then became embroiled in one of the most vicious betrayals of the Horus Heresy. He oversaw the greatest change to the structure of the Space Marines before his death, but his return and resurrection has given the Imperium hope in this dark new era. He is the 13th Primarch, the Avenging Sun, the Lord Commander of the Imperium and the Primarch of the Ultramarines. He is Roboute Guilliman. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to a special and final instalment of Champions of Humanity, a 40k Stories mini-series. Roboute Guilliman was born, supposedly, in the gene laboratories of Luna, Terra's moon, in roughly 800 M30 if Perturbo's estimates are to be believed. This was part of the Primarch project, believed started in M29, but how the Emperor was able to do this given Luna lay in the hands of gene cultists until the Space Marines conquered it, I am actually unsure. Suffice it to say that early Imperial history is a bit of a mess, so getting things in order and getting facts straight is rather difficult. However, as the project neared its conclusion, something went wrong. Very wrong indeed. Potentially due to causal loop chicanery involving the word bearers under Argyll Tal, the Gillifield generators protecting the nascent Primarchs in their capsules malfunctioned or were destroyed. This allowed the Chaos Gods themselves to intervene in an attempt to either corrupt the Primarchs or delay/stop the rise of the Emperor of Mankind, sucking up the capsules into a warp vortex and scattering them across the galaxy, but seemingly not at random. Guilliman and others, including Kurz and Sanguinius, would come to believe this was in fact the Emperor's plan all along, which it could well have been given the nature of many of the worlds that would become home to them. The Primarchs landed on worlds all over the galaxy, and Guilliman himself ended up on the planet Macragge in Ultima Segmentum to the southeast of the galactic centre. Specifically, his pod was found fallen in the forests of Macragge at a place called Hera's Falls, with the infant Primarch within said to be glowing when he was found by hunting nobles who happened to find him. At around the same time, strange portents plagued the populace of Macragge, with perhaps the most notable affecting the leader of the nobles who found or first gave audience to the Primarch, Consul Conor Guilliman, one of the two rulers of Macragge who had dreamed of the Emperor himself. Conor took the infant Primarch under his wing, presumably tying him to the dreams he had been having, and adopted the child whilst giving him the first name Roboute, or Roboute depending on who you ask, meaning Great One. Raised by Conor and his steward or Seneschal Tarashar Uten, it is of no surprise given his Primarch nature that Roboute excelled in his various studies, both academic, political and militaristic. By the age of 10, it is believed his tutors could teach him nothing more than he had already learned, and so it was pretty much already time to apply the learning and training. For all he was a statesman or diplomat, Roboute's truest talent lay on the battlefield, and so his adoptive father gave him a command. Nothing major, just leading an expeditionary force into the mountains against some troublesome, rather uncivilized folks. The wild warriors of Macragge's mountainous north were obviously skilled, having resisted the military of the consuls in the past, but they were no match for a Primarch. Not only did Roboute defeat them, he displayed such tactical acumen and fighting skill that the Wild Ones basically called off their terrorizing of the rest of the planet out of sheer respect for Guilliman. Unfortunately, Roboute's return to the civilized lands saw him confronted with the disaster, a coup d'etat in progress and chaos without the capital C in the streets. Said coup was initiated by Galen, the other consul of Macragge, who probably would have been more at home in the Imperium of today. He despised the populist and pro-citizen policies of his counterpart Conor and had gathered up the rich and powerful slaver nobility of Macragge in an attempt to put the other consul down. By the time of Roboute's return, this was mostly done, as the capital city Macragge Civitas was being sacked and Conor's palace was besieged. The sacking was quelled by the returning armies of the Primarch, whilst Roboute himself rushed to try and see his adopted father, but he arrived too late. Conor lay dying at the hands of an assassin, but with enough strength left to tell his son exactly who was responsible. And armed with that information, Guilliman strode from the palace and utterly crushed his now-dead father's co-consul's rebellion with consummate ease. He inherited the office of consul from Conor, taking the role with the roaring approval of the people his father had worked so tirelessly for, and began to change Macragge into the new world that it would become. The reforms started by Conor were pushed through under the new consul, with the role being his alone as opposed to shared with another. Galen and co were executed, and society changed entirely from the ground up. As far as I can tell, slavery went out of the window along with the privilege of position and power for the few. Macragge became a meritocracy, where hard work was rewarded as opposed to social standing. Thanks to his masterful administrative and stewardship skills, Guilliman was able to take what was already a relatively prosperous planet by post-Age of Strife humanity standards and turn it into a powerhouse. And unlike so many worlds who had been isolated by the nightmare known to the humans as Old Night, Macragge was not alone in the galaxy. Thanks to its industry and presumably Dark Age of Technology era sublight spacecraft, the world was still connected to its neighbouring worlds and systems in some way or another. Thus, when Macragge prospered, I suspect that nearby worlds prospered too, and even if the wealth and success did not spread from Macragge, then word of it certainly did. It was through this hearsay that the knowledge of Roboute Guilliman would reach the ears of the individuals searching for him and his lost brothers, the Emperor of Mankind. The Lord of Humanity first caught wind of the prodigal son of Conor on the nearby planet of Espandor, whilst Roboute was out on campaign in the north of Macragge, and he realised almost immediately that he had found one of his lost Primarchs. Unfortunately, a freak warp storm ended up throwing off or otherwise delaying the attempts of the Emperor to make the relatively short hop to Macragge, meaning that by the time the Great Crusade made it to Guilliman, the Primarch had been ruling the planet for roughly 5 years already. And the Emperor was said to be impressed with his son's work in making his home a powerful military and trading post. It is believed that the reunion between the Emperor and Roboute Guilliman went smoothly. They say many Primarchs pledged allegiance on the spot after somehow recognising the Lord of Mankind, and I believe Guilliman falls into that category too, since he's not listed as doing anything out of the ordinary when the Emperor came calling. He was the 8th Primarch to be rediscovered by the Great Crusade, and on his reunion with the Emperor, Guilliman was given command of the Legion of Astartes created from his genetic material. This was the 13th of the Legiones Astartes, known as the Warborn in reference to their origins on Terra. But under the almost typical Legion reforms instituted on the arrival of a Primarch, the 13th became known, then as they are now, as the Ultramarines. With Primarch and Legion reunited under a new colour scheme and symbol, the Ultramarines fully relocated to Macragge and joined the Imperium's Great Crusade anew. Under Roboute Guilliman, the Ultramarines met with great success during their campaigns in the Great Crusade. The stories say that they were the most successful legion of all, with the exception of the Lunar Wolves or Sons of Horus, in terms of not only sheer number of worlds conquered, but also in terms of conquering speed and in the restoration of worlds to working order post-compliance. Guilliman was a major part of this, as he refused to leave the worlds he conquered in a non-functional state, and he was able to apply what he'd done on Macragge to make the turnaround as swift as possible. A pro-citizen government was always set up, the defences of the conquered planet were always left in a sufficiently powerful state, and where it was possible, trade routes were established to ensure that the Imperium could benefit from its new acquisition and, in theory at least, the world itself always had access to whatever it needed. It speaks volumes to his skill as a statesman and reformer that Guilliman was able to do all of this while still maintaining the fast-conquering nature of the Great Crusade, something that other reformatory Primarchs like, for example, Lorgar, could never hope to match. Guilliman's skill as commander and organiser also paid dividends for the legion he led, as the ultramarine casualty rates were kept to a minimum, which allowed the legion to swell in numbers massively thanks to the setup on Macragge and surrounding worlds left by the Primarch in what became known as the Ultramar Empire, or the 500 Worlds. They became the largest legion of all as far as we can tell, but Guilliman was not arrogant enough to simply believe that his legion was invincible. Mind you, he was confident enough to believe his legion could never lose, provided they had the right ally. Specifically, any one of Leman Russ's Space Wolves, Rogal Dorn's Imperial Fists, Ferrus Manus' Iron Hands, or Sanguinius' Blood Angels. It was in these four that Guilliman placed the greatest trust, referring to the quartet as the Dauntless Few, but he was valued to some of the other Primarchs as well. Following his ascension to War Master, Horus had Guilliman, along with Rogal Dorn, as his closest of advisors, though I do doubt they were best of friends somehow. Horus had Sanguinius, and Guilliman doesn't really seem the type. The actual ascension of Horus itself at Ullanor was a contentious point amongst the Primarchs for many reasons, but Guilliman was among the group to accept it willingly, believing that the Primarch of the 16th did actually deserve the role more than any other. However, at the same time, there were those Primarchs with whom Guilliman was absolutely not friends and probably not allied either. Though he wasn't found until much later, Alfarius or Omegon, or perhaps both but probably Alfarius, managed to pretty comprehensively get on Guilliman's bad side before the end of the Great Crusade, at least as far as the 20th Legion were concerned. Though concerns were raised by Guilliman, Mortarion, and others as early as the Ullanor Crusade, it is believed that the 13th Primarch really lost his rag with his brother sometime later in the Testra Compliance. In essence, Alfarius was far too flexible for the taste of Guilliman, who was rather fond of order, structure, and planning, and that sort of thing. It got a little petty and eventually nearly got violent, with Guilliman using the combat record of the Ultramarines to loudly demonstrate the superiority of his rigid approach. However, this was hardly a fair argument, since Guilliman was found potentially a couple hundred years before Alfarius, so of course the record of the 13th was vastly superior to the 20th, if nothing else due to sheer time. Of course, neither were truly right or truly wrong, as military strategy requires organisation and fluidity depending on circumstance, and it will become evident much later that Guilliman did learn from Alfarius and or Omegon, even if he likely rankled at the idea. The other, perhaps more infamous, inter-Primarch rivalry to involve Guilliman was the one with Lorgar Aurelian of the Word-Bearers. In truth, I don't really think Guilliman had any particular problem with Lorgar personally. This one was, well, the Emperor's doing. Lorgar's conquering policy was somewhat similar to Guilliman's, namely, worlds were set up before his legion moved on. However, whilst Guilliman focused on defence and government, Lorgar seemed to lean more toward religion in line with his later Lectitio Divinitatus that would become the foundation of the Imperial Creed. It made sure that worlds were entirely compliant, but the whole process was mighty slow, perhaps making the Word-Bearers the slowest conquering legion of them all. This, and the fact that the Emperor had effectively outlawed religion in the Imperium, led to the Lord of Mankind delivering a reprimand to the 17th Legion, with the target for this being the current pet project of Lorgar, a perfect city on the world of Kerr called Monarchia. However, the Emperor did not simply bring the custodians and co with him to deliver this reprimand, or at least not alone. Instead, Guilliman and the Ultramarines were summoned as well. Guilliman did outwardly support his father's decision to sanction Lorgar, and so he followed the orders of the Emperor to the letter. Monarchia was utterly destroyed, and the Word-Bearers were forced to kneel before the Ultramarines Primarch and the Emperor. However, Roboute is known to have been actually very uncomfortable with the actions of the Emperor and regretted the fact that a likely irreparable wedge was driven between him and Lorgar. Somehow, I doubt he was willing to or able to reconcile with his brother, but he definitely wasn't happy with the situation regardless. Unfortunately, about half a century later, he'd be even less happy due to what Lorgar went and got up to. In the period between his fall to chaos and the revealing of the Horus heresy, the corrupted War Master needed a way to take the still loyal Guilliman out of the equation due to both his brain and his legion's numbers. To do this, the Ultramarines were distracted and displaced as Horus deployed them to the Viridian or Viridia system in eastern Ultramar under the pretense of an impending Orc invasion, whilst the traitor legions set their plans into motion. Specifically, Guilliman was ordered to muster on the world of Calth and obeyed without hesitation, having no reason to distrust his brother at that time. 20 of the 22 chapters of the Ultramarines were there to rendezvous with the Word-Bearers, feeding suspicion that this was a political exercise amongst Guilliman and others. But this guess would prove to be right in a way that even the Primarch couldn't understand. After several days of oddities both known and unknown, the Ultramarines found themselves being fired upon and killed in great numbers by the Word-Bearers. Guilliman originally assumed a mistake on Lorgar's part, but after a few minutes he reluctantly concluded that the battle was on. He came to realise that the whole thing was orchestrated and planned as opposed to being something more spontaneous, and his venomous message to Lorgar baited his brother to reveal the wider heresy to Guilliman. Unfortunately, this ended in a demonic incursion aboard his flagship, the Macrag's Honour, causing Guilliman to be vented into space and forced to fight his way back inside. Guilliman's strategy, along with heroics from individuals including Marius Gage and Aedith Thiel, kept the Ultramarines in the fight, and they would eventually end up victorious after Guilliman almost killed Corferon of the Word-Bearers, though in truth Guilliman should have died to an Athame dagger in that fight. After this, the Ultramarines entered the heresy at large, but they would not do it alone, as they found themselves meeting with another legion set up and ambushed by the forces of Chaos, the Blood Angels, and their Primarch Sanguinius. The 9th Legion had just survived the hell of the Cygnus cluster, and had arrived in Ultramar somewhat by accident. They had intended to travel to Terra, but the only stable warp region they were able to find was instead Ultramar. The two Primarchs would find their way back to Macragge, but the Ultramarines still had a score to settle with the Word-Bearers, who were ravaging much of Ultramar alongside Angron and the World Eaters in what became known as the Shadow Crusade. This was a bloody war by design, and it took a long time for the Ultramarines to properly catch up with the traitors, but Guilliman finally got his chance on the former homeworld of Angron himself, New Seria. Admittedly, this battle didn't exactly go that well for the Ultramarines. The powerful flagships of the Word-Bearers kept them honest in space, and on the ground Lorgar proved to be far nastier a combatant than expected by Guilliman. The arrival of Angron into the Primarch's duel proved critical, and Guilliman was forced into a hasty retreat from the enraged Red Angel, whilst Lorgar channeled power to ascend Angron to demonhood and fully power up the galaxy-dividing warp storm known as the Ruin Storm, cutting off-ish Ultima Segmentum from Terra and the rest of the Western Galaxy. This trapped Guilliman, along with Sanguinius and, as it happened, Lionel Johnson, on the wrong side of the Ruin Storm and unable to reach Terra to defend it. And with no knowledge of events on the Cradle of Humanity, Guilliman took it upon himself to try and preserve what he could of the Emperor's domain lest it fall without his knowledge. So was born Imperium Secundus in 009 M31, a contingency to try and rebuild the Imperium, but Guilliman did not wish to put himself on a pedestal and become his backup empire's emperor. He first offered the post to the Dark Angels Primarch, but the Lion refused, and eventually it was Sanguinius who reluctantly took the title of Emperor Regent, whilst Guilliman became Lord Warden. The trio of Primarchs would run Imperium Secundus together for about 5 years, with the Pharos Beacon on Sotha nearby able to draw many loyalist forces to Ultramar despite the Ruin Storm, but it was far from a quiet time for Guilliman and co. Most notably, Sotha and the Pharos itself were assaulted by the Night Lords toward the end, causing an overload of the device that probably attracted the Tyranids to the galaxy. But there was much more chicanery to go on before we got to that. Both the Salamander Primarch Vulcan and the Night Lords Conrad Kurz ended up on Macragge as well, the former having teleported and crash-landed there, escaping from the latter, who had later hidden aboard the flagship of the Dark Angels. Vulcan died again and again in a running duel with Kurz before finally being killed outright by John Grammaticus. Guilliman would craft the stasis casket that later bore the Salamander's Primarch back to his home of Nocturne, where they finally took their leave. As for Kurz, he was eventually captured by Lionel Johnson, but Guilliman and the Lion had a lot of arguments in the run-up to this incident regarding Lion's wish to use weapons of mass destruction to flush the Night Haunter out. Guilliman then had to stop Lion from killing Kurz after the 8th Primarch antagonized the 1st, and Lion would be asked to leave Imperium Secundus soon after, though he did return later. Eventually, word got somehow through the Ruin Storm that Terra still stood, the Emperor yet lived, and thus Imperium Secundus was no longer necessary. The backup Imperium was dissolved soon after as the Primarch trio, with Kurz as their prisoner, making plans to get back to Terra as they had been asked to do so long ago by Rogel Dawn. However, there was still a massive Ruin Storm-shaped wall in their path, and even the Tactica engine secured by the Dark Angels was having difficulty getting through Erebus's creation. However, after a battle in the Anuari system that would change completely, as Chaos-corrupted navigators were captured by the Ultramarines following a space battle against a mix of traitor legions. These renegades could seemingly navigate the warp and Ruin Storm with much more ease than their Imperial counterparts, and for some odd reason, they were willing, if not eager, to take the Loyalists along for the ride. Unfortunately for Guilliman, he came into possession of Athame blades during the boarding of his flagship at the time by Dark Apostles. Corfarian had almost killed the Primarch with one earlier, and now Guilliman sought to study the Athame in order to turn them on the traitors, which, you could argue, was the first step on his road to corruption. The next obstacle facing the triumvirate of former Imperium Secundus was, once again, the warp. The Piran system was converted into a gigantic warp fortress with planet-sized guns and tethered to the system's primary world. Guilliman joined Sanguinius and Johnson in the invasion of said world, with the Ultramarines' role keeping the demonic forces on the back foot so as to prevent their cousins from being overrun. Ultimately, it was the Blood Angels who dealt the decisive blows, and in a vision of his own death at Horus's hand, and 1 in 1,000 showing him winning, Sanguinius bade his brothers join him on a journey to the world where the Horus heresy was laid out, Davin, where Horus had been corrupted years prior. Sanguinius made a landing on the world despite Lion's reservations, and when the Dark Angels Primarch realised that he almost ordered exterminatus on Davin despite his brother's presence on the planet, Guilliman came to see that they may well have been tempted by the corruption that had got to Horus, Lorgar, and others. In response, Roboute destroyed the Athame daggers he had taken from the Word-bearers, potentially saving himself and many others in the process. He then joined Lion and Sanguinius planetside, helping Lion destroy a titanic soul-grinded demon engine before running distraction on a traitor blockade once Davin was destroyed to allow the Blood Angels to reach Terra as fast as possible. Though he was not at Terra during the siege of the Imperial Palace, having helped Sanguinius to get there instead and meet his own fate, there are those who say that Roboute Guilliman was one of the critical factors behind the defeat of Horus. Having made steady progress against the Iron Warrior blockade, the Ultramarines and Dark Angels, supposedly with others, headed for the Cradle of Humanity with all haste. It is thought that the knowledge of this, enemy reinforcement from the largest legions they perhaps his own, along with 2 highly renowned Primarchs, was one of the reasons for Horus to lower the shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, allowing the Emperor and Sanguinius to come and face him and ultimately end the Horus heresy. Guilliman was seemingly just a few hours late on saving Sanguinius and the Emperor from their fates at the War Master's hands, but he did not sit idle in the aftermath of the Civil War. Presumably due to his skill as a statesman and thanks to having the largest legions still standing on the Loyalist side, Guilliman took the role of Lord Commander of the Imperium, giving him authority over all military assets of the Imperium, a role that no individual had ever held up to that point, given even the Emperor had a war council. With these armed forces at his command and a seat at the Senatorium Imperialis that had been formed out of the now abolished Council of Terror, Guilliman spearheaded the reclamation of the Imperium in the Great Scouring and began to reform the Imperium just as he had before with Macragge and his legion. Perhaps the greatest of these reforms, certainly one of the largest and most controversial, was the penning and implementation of the Codex Astartes in roughly 021 M31. Guilliman was of the opinion that, having seen the damage caused by the traitor legions, no one person should wield that much power again. We'll gloss over the fact he was literally running the entire Imperial military at this time. The point is sound, if a little odd, given the circumstances, making him sound like a hypocrite. To ensure that no one had a full legion at their command, the Codex Astartes would divide them into much smaller chapters of 1,000 marines each, with one chapter maintaining the legion's original name and colours. This proposal was, well, let's just say it was unpopular. Rogal Dorn in particular was exceptionally unimpressed, accusing Guilliman of cowardice for not being at the Siege of Terra, which, to be fair, is pretty harsh, given his delaying tactics allowed Sanguinius to make it, whilst Guilliman went and flat out called Dorn a traitor for not accepting his codex, which is exceptionally uncalled for. The other loyalist Primarchs then broadly fell into one camp or another as things escalated to another near-civil war state known as the Codex Crisis. However, eventually, Guilliman won, perhaps obviously given the fact we now have chapters instead of legions in the Imperium today. Dorn backed down, Rust pretty much didn't comply, but his legion wouldn't divide anyway due to genetic issues, and Vulcan Salamanders never had the numbers to divide anyway. The others were a bit happier with it. Other reforms were implemented in a similar vein to the Codex around this time, such as the stripping down of Astartes' fleets and the division of the Imperial Army into the Astra Militarum and Imperial Navy of today. Another conversation Guilliman had in the post-heresy era was with a very famous Archmagos of the modern era, Belisarius Cawl. The Lord Commander had two tasks for Cawl, who would of course worked on the original Space Marines alongside the Emperor, even if he'd probably forgot. The first was the creation of a new generation of Space Marines beyond the Astartes of the day, something that would seemingly be finished quite quickly as far as we can tell. The second is, well, I hate to call it a panic reaction or a case of personal vanity, but I don't know what else to call it. Guilliman asked Cawl for a way to resurrect the Primarch if he so happened to die. Cawl would also complete this task at some point in the intervening years, but we don't know when or if he did it 100%. However, all this law-making and diplomacy did nothing to keep Guilliman off the battlefield, as he was involved in two famous battles with the traitor legions in the Great Scouring. One we can loosely date is the harrowing Iron Cage incident that involved the Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors just after the Codex was accepted by Dorn, but not by the Imperial Fists. In truth, the Ultramarines were the relief force here, bailing the Fists out of the potentially doubly fatal war between the Sons of Dorn and Perturabo. Their relief force drove off the Iron Warriors, and the remaining Fists were much more willing to comply with the Codex than they had been before their quote-unquote tempering in the Iron Cage. The second is sadly undated, and pitted the Ultramarines against the Alpha Legion led by probably Omegon but possibly Alfarius but almost certainly Omegon on the world of Escrador. This battle was actually lost by the Ultramarines as the tactics and flexibility of the Alpha Legion forced them to retreat to orbit, but Guilliman claimed perhaps a greater prize in the long run. Defying Alfarius Omegon's criticisms of being predictable in combat, the Lord Commander employed a new stratagem that he had perhaps never used before, catching the 20th completely off guard. This in turn allowed Guilliman to engage his brother in single combat, killing him convincingly, though some suggest this was a dummy Primarch due to blood-related chicanery the Alpha Legion couldn't pull off. Unfortunately, the next time Guilliman crossed blades with one of the traitor Primarchs, things didn't end so well for him. This was the Battle of Thessala in 121 M31, where Guilliman and co were up against the Emperor's children led by the demonic Fulgrim. Unlike the unmutated Alfarius/Omegon, Fulgrim with all his demonic gifts held the edge over his brother, and during the boarding action onto the former 3rd Legion's flagship, the Pride of the Emperor, this advantage showed hugely. After a brief parley that went nowhere, the two squared off and Thorgrim convincingly held the upper hand, and exploiting a scar left by Corferon's Athame dagger centuries prior, the Phoenicians slit Guilliman's throat. Guilliman was teleported out, and the Ultramarines fled whilst being massacred by the Emperor's children, but the damage was done, and the wound was fatal. In the moments before his death, the apothecaries interred their Primarch into stasis, with his body displayed as a shrine on Macragge within a place known as the Temple of Correction. It became one of the holiest places in the Imperium for 10,000 years, with some even claiming that Guilliman's wounds were healing within the stasis field. But it would be at the end of M41 that his internment came to an end. At the climax of the events known as the Gathering Storm, the refugees of Cadia arrived on Macragge, guided by the Inari under the leadership of Yvraine. Macragge at the time was under siege from forces of Abaddon's Black Legion, but whilst most of her compatriots returned to the Webway, Yvraine travelled with Belisarius Cawl to the Temple of Correction. There, despite opposition from many Ultramarines including Chapter Master Marnius Calgar, her abilities and the technology of Cawl restored Guilliman to life just in time for the Primarch to save his home from being overrun by the forces of chaos. Following his resurrection, Guilliman took some time to assess the new Imperium he found himself in, and he was not impressed. I suspect that in particular the Ecclesiarchy really wound him up, though I can't verify that, but bear in mind they weren't around until something like a millennium after his death. That said, he was a pragmatist above all else, and quickly devised his new plan going forward. Despite the clutches of Nurgle infecting Ultramar, with only his presence able to seemingly drive it back, the Primarch decided to travel to Terra, to see and speak to the Emperor if possible. A huge Imperial force was gathered for what became known as the Terran Crusade, but progress was slow, mainly due to the massive amounts of disruption in the warp created by the Chaos Gods in response to Guilliman's return. As they eventually neared the massive warp rift known as the Maelstrom, the Crusade ran into even more trouble, this time in the shape of another of the traitor Primarchs, Magnus the Red. The Crimson King used his power to pull the entire Crusade into the Maelstrom via a dark ritual, and after repulsing a Red Corsair attack that followed their arrival, it was revealed by Kairos Fateweaver that the intent was seemingly to trap Guilliman there forever. However, the Harlequin Shadowseer Silandri Veilwalker was somehow able to guide the Imperials somewhat, even as Kairos tried to subtly, then violently, destroy Guilliman. And somehow, the Lord of Change won even when face to face with the Primarch, forcing him to his knees and driving the other Imperials to surrender lest their Primarch be slain. Taken prisoner by the Red Corsairs and moved to Huron Blackheart's own personal Blackstone fortress, it could have been the end for Guilliman, but the great game between the gods was still being played as forces of Khorne attacked the Tzeentchian defenders of the fortress in search of the Primarch's head. This allowed Veilwalker, accompanied by Cypher and the Fallen Angels of all people, to sneak in and free the Imperial prisoners who fled into the Webway with the aid of an out-of-nowhere appearance by the Legion of the Damned. Guilliman did have to go through the Bloodthirster Scarbrand on the way out, mind you, but with the aid of the Black Templars Marshal who had fled Cadia, the demon was taken down and the escape was good. And somehow, even now the rapidly dwindling Crusade couldn't catch a break, as the Thousand Sons were back on their tail before long. Realising that leaving the Webway on Terra would potentially allow Magnus' forces to directly invade the Cradle of Humanity, with Magnus perhaps banking on exactly that happening, Guilliman and Veilwalker took an executive decision to change the original plan to run straight for Terra at all speed. Instead, they took the junction before and hopped out on Terra's moon of Luna, something of a homecoming for Guilliman, I suppose, given this was supposedly where he was created. But they couldn't get the portal closed fast enough before Magnus and the Thousand Sons came through behind them. A massive battle broke out as for the first time since his return, Loyalist and traitor Primarch duelled, and Guilliman and Magnus went head to head. And just like aboard the Pride of the Emperor millennia before, demonic power won out, as Magnus' incredibly potent psychic power all but overwhelmed his brother. But this time, the Imperium was able to bail Guilliman out. The arrival of the Sisters of Silence and Adeptus Custodes, among others, pushed back the Thousand Suns and weakened Magnus, allowing Veil Walker to drive him back to the Webway and seal the portal before Guilliman was defeated or killed again. With peace at last, the Terran Crusade finally limped home under escort to Terra, and Guilliman was finally able to enter the Golden Throne Room after some hard bargaining with the Custodian Shield Captain to get in. The conversation between the Primarch and the Emperor went on for a night and a day, and whilst none know exactly what was said save the individuals involved, it seems to have had an effect on Guilliman, though whether this was the desired one, it's hard to know for sure. Once he left the throne room, the Senatorium Imperialis was convened, and the Primarch reinstated himself as Lord Commander of the Imperium and later as the Imperial Regent. Using the masses of Primaris Space Marines, the other of Call's assigned projects, the Odometers Crusade was launched soon after to reclaim and fortify the Imperium on both sides of the newly appeared Cicatrix Maledictum. Guilliman would command the Crusade from the front in many battles, including helping the Blood Angels against High Fleet Leviathan and installing Commander Dante as the Warden of the Dark Imperium, all whilst instituting more reform within the Imperium and aiding Yvraine with intelligence from time to time. Though modifications have been made to accommodate Primaris into the Codex Astartes, the greatest reform of the time that we know of is the document still being worked on, known as the Codex Imperialis. This is designed as a civil document, cleaning up the government and bureaucracy of the Imperium, as opposed to dealing with the military as much as the post-heresy reform did. It is believed that it will also include an accurate imperial history, though how Guilliman could write such a tale is unclear, given he's been in stasis for, well, almost all of it. However, the Indomitors Crusade could not last forever, and after roughly a century, Guilliman officially called its end with a triumph of his own in the Pit of Rorkos. The crusading forces were dispersed, and Guilliman finally acknowledged the Nurgle-based troubles in Ultramar that had escalated to become the Plague Wars. Introducing the Primaris to Ultramar along with other reinforcements proved incredibly useful, as the forces of Nurgle led by the Death Guard Primarch Mortarion were cut off from many of their own reinforcements. The war was costly on all sides, and though the Imperium did begin to turn the tide, they paid for it with every step taken. And it would be on the agri-world of Ajax that things finally came to a head. Here, Guilliman would duel Mortarion personally, this time with no clear victor, and just as the Death Lord retreated under the cover of virus bombs, Nurgle would call his forces back somewhat to deal with invasions into the nearby Scourge Stars by his fellow Chaos Gods. Guilliman took some time after this to ensure his home would rebuild following the Plague Wars, probably antagonising Marneus Calgar along the way, before running the Imperium called him back to the job. He's likely been all over the place since then, whether on Terra or at war in the wider Imperium or on a diplomatic mission for some reason. Although things might be at their worst since the Age of Strife for some, many are whispering that the return of the Emperor's son, quote-unquote, is perhaps a dawn of a new age of hope for the Imperium and for humanity. Oh, and he's also finally got around to authorising the upgrading to Primaris, as we've now seen with Marneus Calgar. But details are lacking at this time. We shall see what comes of it and how long it takes before everybody does it, if they do. Oh, and he also has the Emperor's sword, thanks to Call giving it to him on his resurrection. I realised I forgot to mention that earlier. Kind of a major detail. Apologies. So ends the tale of Roboute Guilliman, at least for now. Having witnessed the Imperium at its height and in its darkest days, the Lord Commander and Primarch has had an eventful life both before and after his death and subsequent resurrection. Perhaps of all the Primarchs, none have affected the Imperium quite like Roboute Guilliman. His codex defines the Adeptus Astartes to this day, his instruction to Call led the new Primaris Marines, and his Codex Imperialis looked set to shake the messy workings of the Imperium up as well. In this dark new age, it is understandable why so many see him as a beacon of hope and progress, and whilst I do not doubt that his tale has many more twists and turns to come, I am intrigued to see what the Imperium looks like given enough time under his stewardship. For now though, that is the end, both of this log and of the Champions of Humanity miniseries. I'm aware that there are many more champions we could address, and I may well try and cover some in future, but this seems like a natural place to end the series. Next time, I think we'll be diving in to explore perhaps the largest servants, or, well, weapons of chaos. We looked at their counterparts within the Imperium long ago, as well as their smaller cousins amongst the armies of the Dark Gods, but many of them have a storied history that I feel is worth exploring. For now though, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis. I hope you've enjoyed this final installment of Champions of Humanity, the 20,000 subscriber special. Still need to ask that gay Vesa what it means. I'll see you all again. Goodbye.